Get him off this executive floor, right now. The CEO's voice cut through the high-ceilinged glass corridor like a precision blade, instantly freezing the murmuring board members mid-sentence. She didn't look back as she pointed a manicured finger directly at the quiet maintenance worker, standing near the floor-to-ceiling glass paneling of the main conference suite. This entire sector is restricted to executive personnel, Natalie Sterling continued, her sharp heels clicking a rhythmic, intimidating cadence against the pristine white quartz flooring. And as of this exact second, you are terminated. A few junior executives offered forced, sycophantic chuckles. Someone whispered that the grease monkey must have taken a wrong turn from the freight elevator. The cold humiliation hung heavy in the air of the upper sanctuary where multi-billion-dollar deals were signed and legacies were manufactured. But the man being publicly stripped of his livelihood didn't argue. He didn't beg for his job, nor did he raise his voice to defend his presence on the 40th floor. Instead, Garrett Vance merely offered a single measured nod. His expression remained entirely unreadable, calm, collected, and projecting a quiet masculinity that seemed completely unaffected by the wealthy crowd staring him down. Natalie Sterling adjusted her tailored charcoal blazer, her eyes flashing with a mix of impatience and deep-seated stress. She was a woman who commanded thousands of employees across Vanguard Global, a tech and infrastructure conglomerate, but today her tolerance for deviations from protocol was absolute zero. "You don't belong on this level," she added, her tone dropping into an icy register that usually sent vice presidents scrambling. "Security will see to it that you are escorted out of the building immediately." "Understood, Mom," Garrett replied simply. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, devoid of anger or resentment. That complete lack of desperation irritated Natalie more than an emotional outburst would have. It felt as though he was looking through the corporate theater, seeing something else entirely. Donovan Cross, the towering director of corporate security, stepped forward, his hand resting near his blazer lapel. "Time to move, buddy. Let's make this easy." Garrett turned smoothly, his posture straight and athletic beneath the faded blue canvas of his work uniform. As he walked toward the executive elevator bank, the wall of suits behind the CEO immediately closed up, resuming their frantic chatter about foreign market shares and quarterly projections. They dismissed him as a ghost, an insignificant cog chewed up and spat out by the corporate machine. But Garrett Vance had heard far worse things in his life than the dismissal of an arrogant executive, much worse. The elevator doors glided open with a soft electronic chime. Garrett stepped inside with Cross, the hum of the high-speed transit system masking the sudden silence of the car. Cross looked at the quiet worker, out of the corner of his eye as the numbers began their rapid descent. "You shouldn't have been up there, Vance," Cross said, his voice dropping to a less aggressive, almost conversational tone. "The boss is dealing with a massive investor audit today. She's looking for heads to roll." "I'm aware," Garrett murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on the descending digital floor indicator. "You're aware?" Cross frowned, trying to read the man. "You don't look like a guy who just lost his health care." Garrett didn't expand on the thought. He kept his silence until the doors parted at the sub-basement service level, revealing the raw, industrial underbelly of the Meridian Spire. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Upstairs was an oasis of polished stone and soft lighting. Down here, massive climate control conduits throbbed with raw energy, concrete walls were exposed, and the air carried the heavy metallic scent of industrial lubricant and heavy machinery. Garrett walked to his locker near the primary maintenance station. A small circular magnet held a single photograph against the dented gray steel door. It was a picture of a 7-year-old girl with fiercely bright blue eyes and a chaotic halo of brown curls, grinning widely while missing one of her front teeth. Chloe, his entire world. Garrett carefully removed his heavy-duty work gloves and placed them inside the locker, his movements methodical, precise, and completely devoid of panic. Toby Miller, a 20-something junior technician, looked up from a workbench piled with circuit boards. "Man, I just heard the radio chatter. The Ice Queen actually cut you loose right there in front of the board?" "Word travels fast," Garrett said, untying his work boots. Toby shook his head in disbelief. "You've been here a year, and you know the plumbing and structural layout of this spire better than the guys who drew the blueprints." "She's crazy. What are you gonna do?" "I'm going to go pick up my daughter from school," Garrett said softly, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking through his stoic demeanor. "You can't bring a bad attitude home with the groceries." Before Toby could reply, an unusual low-frequency hum vibrated through the concrete flooring beneath their feet. It wasn't the standard mechanical pulse of the building's massive ventilation system. It was a rhythmic, deep shudder that caused a loose wrench on Toby's workbench to slide a fraction of an inch to the left. Garrett froze. His eyes didn't look at the heavy machinery across the room. Instead, His gaze snapped instantly to a dark, unmonitored electrical relay panel mounted high on the structural column behind the workbench. A single secondary indicator light, one that should have been a steady, reassuring green, flickered a dull, ominous crimson. It pulsed twice, then went completely dark. Toby didn't even notice. But Garrett's jaw tightened. He stepped toward the panel, his calm demeanor shifting instantly into something sharp, focused, and intensely alert. "What is it?" Toby asked, noticing the sudden change in the older man's posture. Garrett didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his bare fingers hovering just a millimeter away from the metal housing of the relay, feeling the faint, abnormal heat radiating through the steel casing. "Something just shifted in the core," Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying an undeniable weight. And it wasn't a routine adjustment. Toby leaned over the workbench, squinting at the dark indicator light. "It's probably just a faulty copper solenoid in the secondary line," he said, dismissively waving a wrench. "This old spire has been settling for 30 years. Half the sensors down here are ghosting anyway. You shouldn't let it get to you, especially not on your last day." Garrett didn't drop his gaze from the metal column. His hand remained flat against the structural steel, tracking a micro-vibration that was entirely too rhythmic to be a standard baseline shift. A normal mechanical settling pattern had a decaying frequency. This was steady. It felt like a system under tension, trying desperately to find equilibrium against an unnatural force. The red light suddenly flashed one more time, bright and angry, before snapping back to a solid, deceitful green. To an untrained eye, the anomaly had resolved itself. "See?" Toby smiled, turning back to his circuit board. "Just a glitch. You're overthinking it, Vance." Garrett pulled his hand back, his face tightening almost imperceptibly. "I don't overthink, Toby. I observe." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his personal phone. The lock screen lit up with the image of Chloe, wearing an oversized astronaut helmet, her gap-toothed smile radiating pure joy. Beside the phone, he pulled out a small piece of folded construction paper she had tucked into his lunchbox that morning. It was a crude crayon drawing of a towering blue castle with two stick figures standing at the base. One figure wore a tiny lopsided crown. Garrett carefully folded the paper and slipped it into his civilian jacket. He looked back at the massive structural pillar. Every instinct forged during his years in the elite military engineering corps told him that the Meridian Spire had just whispered its first, and perhaps only, warning. Upstairs on the 40th floor, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of mechanical intuition, replaced instead by corporate panic. Natalie Sterling strode down the executive corridor like a localized storm system. Her assistant, Avery Prescott, struggling to keep pace while balancing a tablet and a stack of financial portfolios. "The European Investment Consortium is already refusing to sign the expansion clause," Avery warned, his voice tight with anxiety. "They saw the maintenance reports from the lower levels. They think the infrastructure costs are going to bleed the fourth quarter margins dry. Then tell them we will absorb the baseline maintenance guarantees ourselves," Natalie snapped, not slowing her pace. "I didn't spend 3 years restructuring Vanguard Global just to let a few nervous bankers dictate our capital deployment." "Where is the chief structural engineer?" "He's downstairs inspecting the primary cooling conduits," Avery replied, adjusting his glasses. "He said everything is within normal operating parameters." Natalie stopped abruptly outside her private office suite. She took a slow, controlled breath, her polished exterior masking the crushing weight of the board's expectations. She was feared by her competitors and revered by her peers for her ruthless efficiency. But today, the pressure was suffocating. She pushed the heavy oak door open, expecting silence, but instead found her 8-year-old daughter, Maya, sitting on the leather sofa, swinging her legs while holding a drawing pad. "Maya?" Natalie blinked in surprise, her authoritative posture softening by a fraction. "What are you doing up here? You were supposed to be down in the lobby lounge with the childcare staff." "They were boring," Maya said without looking up from her sketch, her voice carrying the blunt honesty only a child could possess. "And the lady downstairs kept talking on her phone. I wanted to see you." Natalie felt a familiar, sharp pang of guilt. She walked over, kneeling beside the sofa, her hands resting gently on Maya's shoulders. The cold, impenetrable CEO vanished for a brief second, revealing a mother who was utterly exhausted. "Sweetheart, I'm in the middle of a massive negotiation," Natalie said, her voice dropping into a rare, gentle tone. "You can't be roaming the executive suites today. It's not safe with all the equipment movement, and I need you to stay in one place." Maya looked up, her wide eyes reflecting the gray winter skyline outside the massive windows. "The building made a weird noise earlier, Mommy. Like a big tummy growl. It shook my juice box." Natalie frowned, casting a quick, questioning look toward Avery, who simply shrugged. "It's just the ventilation adjusting for the cold weather," Natalie assured her, kissing the top of Maya's head. "Stay here with Avery for 10 minutes. I have to step into the boardroom to finalize the presentation." Do not leave this room. Maya sighed but picked up her colored pencil again. Okay. Natalie stood up, her face instantly hardening back into its corporate mask as she turned toward the boardroom door. But as her hand touched the polished silver handle, the lights overhead suddenly dipped. The brilliant white LED panels flickered once, dying completely for a terrifying 2 seconds before the emergency auxiliary power kicked in, bathing the luxurious floor in an eerie, low-voltage amber glow. Deep within the walls, a sharp metallic snap echoed, followed by a low descending groan that vibrated through the glass panels. The amber emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the executive boardroom. Inside, the brilliant minds of Vanguard Global's investment circle were completely silent, their eyes darting from the flickering ceiling panels to the massive glass windows. The building groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that felt less like mechanical failure and more like a massive entity shifting its weight under immense torment. Natalie Sterling stood frozen at the head of the mahogany conference table. For a woman who prided herself on absolute control, the sudden loss of power and the terrifying structural sound felt like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She quickly clamped them over the edge of the table to hide the vulnerability from her board members. What was that? One of the senior investors demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. Natalie, you said the infrastructure was completely secure. It is, Natalie said, her voice forced into a rigid, calm mold that she didn't entirely feel. Avery, contact the engineering deck immediately. Tell them to clear the auxiliary grid. Avery Prescott was already frantically tapping on his tablet, his face pale under the amber glare. The network is completely down, ma'am. There's no internal comms. The cellular relays in the core must have tripped during the power dip. Suddenly, the heavy, double-paned glass doors at the entrance of the executive suite slid shut with a resounding motorized clunk. A thick, reinforced steel security grate dropped seamlessly from the ceiling header, locking into the quartz floor with absolute finality. The automated containment protocol, Avery whispered, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The building thinks there's a catastrophic breach. It's sealing the floors to protect the structural integrity of the upper decks. We're completely locked in. Panic erupted around the table. Wealthy men and women stood up, spilling their expensive sparkling water, shouting over one another, rushing toward the sealed security grates. They hammered their fists against the reinforced metal, demanding to be let out, their billions of dollars completely useless against the unyielding engineering of the automated spire. Amidst the screaming and the chaotic shouting, Natalie didn't look at her board. Her heart seized as her gaze snapped to the corner of the room where her daughter sat. Maya had dropped her colored pencils, her small face completely pale as she stared at the flashing emergency lights. The little girl began to cry, a soft, terrified sound completely swallowed by the adult hysteria in the room. Natalie rushed over to the sofa, pulling Maya into her arms, pressing her daughter's face against her shoulder. "It's okay, baby. It's okay, Mommy's here," she murmured desperately. But her own voice lacked conviction. Natalie looked around the room, feeling completely helpless. She could handle hostile takeovers and aggressive hedge funds, but she had absolutely no power over the terrifying structural reality closing in around them. A sudden heavy metallic thud echoed from the back of the suite, near the service access corridor. The frantic board members silenced themselves, turning slowly toward the sound. A heavy access panel on the wall screechingly unlatched, swinging open to reveal the dark concrete service stairwell behind it. Out of the darkness stepped Garrett Vance. He was carrying a heavy canvas tool bag over his shoulder. His face was completely calm, his breathing steady despite having just climbed 40 flights of concrete stairs in the dark. He didn't look at the panicked executives. His eyes immediately scanned the room, assessing the exit points, the structural load indicators on the wall, and the state of the people inside. Natalie stared at him in utter shock. "You?" she breathed, her corporate defense mechanism instantly kicking in despite the crisis. "I thought I told security to throw you out of this building. How did you even get up here?" "The executive elevators are dead in the shafts," Garrett said, his low baritone voice cutting through the remaining tension in the room like a steady anchor. "And the automated containment grid just locked down your primary stairwells. This service access is the only unsealed conduit left on the upper 10 floors. He didn't wait for her permission." Garrett dropped his heavy tool bag with a solid, grounding thud and walked directly past the staring executives. He approached the corner sofa where Natalie was holding Maya. "Don't touch her," Natalie said defensively, tightening her grip on her daughter. Garrett didn't flinch or look intimidated by her sharp tone. Instead, he slowly dropped to one knee, bringing himself exactly down to Maya's eye level. The heavy, intimidating aura of his quiet masculinity seemed to shift instantly into something incredibly warm, grounded, and intensely protective. "Hey there," Garrett said softly, ignoring the mother entirely. His voice was incredibly gentle, carrying a natural soothing strength. "I'm Garrett." Maya peeked out from her mother's shoulder, her tear-streaked face looking into his steady, warm blue eyes. "Is the building going to fall down?" she whispered, her lower lip trembling. Garrett offered her a small, reassuring smile, his large, calloused hand reaching out to gently pick up one of the dropped colored pencils from the floor. "Not on my watch, kiddo," he said quietly. "This big old castle is just having a little bit of trouble finding its balance. But I know exactly where it hurts, and I'm going to fix it. Do you believe me?" Maya looked at him for a long moment. There was no money, no corporate title, and no expensive suit to project authority, but the little girl recognized true safety when she saw it. She slowly nodded her head, her crying stopping almost instantly as she wiped her eyes. Natalie watched the exchange in stunned silence. She looked at the man she had cruelly dismissed just an hour prior, realizing that while her vast wealth had bought her everything else in the world, it couldn't buy the absolute emotional security this humble maintenance worker had just given her child with a single sentence. Garrett stood back up, his expression instantly hardening as he turned back to face Natalie and the silent, staring board members. "We have exactly 12 minutes before the automated thermal system completely locks the secondary release valves in the sub-basement," Garrett stated flatly. "If that happens, the pressure in the eastern structural core will reach its critical failure threshold." "What do you want us to do?" Avery asked, his voice shaking. Garrett slung his tool bag back over his shoulder. "You're going to stay right here, keep the kid calm, and let me do my job." Preston Brooks stepped forward, his multi-$1,000 tailored suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. As one of the primary venture capitalists backing Vanguard Global, he was used to treating everyone below a certain tax bracket as completely invisible. He blocked Garrett's path to the auxiliary wall terminal, his breathing shallow and frantic. "Listen to me, you," Brooks stammered, pulling a thick leather wallet from his jacket. "I don't care what kind of game you're playing or what grudge you have against Natalie. I will wire $1 million to any account you want right now. Just take me down that service stairwell. Forget the rest of them. Just get me out of this spire." Garrett stopped. He looked down at the billionaire's trembling hand offering the wallet. The quiet masculinity radiating from Garrett didn't waver. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound freezing disdain. "The service stairwell is currently acting as a chimney for the friction heat venting from the lower elevator shafts," Garrett said, his voice deadly calm and perfectly steady. "Below the 20th floor, the air temperature is already breaching 140 degrees. If you go down there alone, Mr. Brooks, your lungs will burn before you reach the street. Now step away from the console and sit down." Brooks blinked, his face turning an asymmetric shade of pale as he slowly shrank back toward the conference table. The absolute authority in Garrett's voice left no room for negotiation. Natalie watched the interaction from the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around Maya. She felt a sickening wave of realization wash over her. Preston Brooks was a man who could alter the trajectory of national market trends with a single phone call. Yet in this room, under the weight of actual physical danger, he was entirely useless. She looked up at Garrett, whose broad shoulders and unbothered posture made him look like a mountain amidst a crumbling valley. She had everything: money, status, power, except the one thing that mattered right now, peace. And this man was giving it away without even trying. Suddenly, the spire suffered a massive, violent shudder. A deafening crack tore through the room as one of the secondary interior glass walls shattered, raining glittering shards across the polished quartz floor. The building didn't just groan this time. It tilted. Only a fraction of a degree, but enough to cause the heavy mahogany table to slide several inches, screeching against the floorboards. Maya let out a piercing scream, burying her face into her mother's chest. Natalie tried to tighten her grip, but her own body was trembling so violently that her shaking hands only amplified her daughter's terror. She couldn't calm her. She was completely, utterly helpless. Garrett didn't lose his footing. He stepped across the sliding debris, dropping back down beside the terrified mother and child. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded construction paper Chloe had given him that morning. "Hey, look at me, Maya," Garrett said, his voice a low, warm hum that somehow bypassed the chaotic noise of the room. Maya slowly turned her tear-filled eyes toward him. Garrett unfolded the crayon drawing of the blue castle and the two stick figures. "I need a very brave deputy to guard something incredibly important for me," he whispered, pressing the paper into her small, trembling hands. "This is a blueprint of a magical shield. As long as you hold on to it and keep it completely flat, the castle stays standing. Can you do that for me?" Maya looked at the colorful drawing, then up at Garrett's steady, reassuring smile. The raw empathy in his eyes was hypnotic. The little girl's breathing instantly slowed. She squeezed the paper tightly against her chest and nodded, her panic completely dissolving into absolute trust. Natalie looked from her daughter to Garrett, her throat tight with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking, stripping away every ounce of the cold CEO persona she had built over a lifetime. "Please, tell me you can fix this." Garrett stood up, his face hardening back into a mask of pure tactical focus. "I'm going to try." He walked past her to the primary environmental control terminal mounted into the quartz pillar. The screen was flashing a bright, violent error message, completely locked out by the automated corporate security protocols. "We can't access the core systems from here," Avery Prescott said, hovering anxiously behind him. "The corporate firewall requires an unbypassable administrative encryption key. It's a level 5 secure infrastructure layout. It's completely impenetrable, without external network access." Garrett didn't reply. He reached beneath the plastic bezel of the terminal housing, his strong fingers finding a hidden mechanical release latch. With a sharp pull, the entire corporate interface popped forward, exposing a hidden, dust-covered array of fiber-optic cables and a heavy, brutalist steel terminal interface beneath it, a secondary system that wasn't even mentioned in Vanguard Global's modern manuals. Avery's jaw dropped. "What is that?" "That's not part of our system architecture. It's part of the original Civil Defense Foundation," Garrett said flatly. His fingers didn't hesitate. He began hitting a highly specific, unmapped sequence of mechanical toggle switches, with a fluid, muscle memory speed that no civilian maintenance worker could ever possess. The monitor instantly wiped the corporate red error screen, replacing it with a stark dark green command line prompt that read, "Guardian Procol detected. Enter command clearance Sakink." Avery stepped back, his eyes wide with absolute shock as he stared at the screen, then at the man in the faded blue uniform. That's a hardened military tactical network prompt. Only the original defense architecture engineers from the Pentagon have the deployment clearance overrides for this specific grid. "Who the hell are you, Vance?" Garrett didn't look back. His hand hovered over the primary manual execution lever as the building suffered another deep, sickening vibration. The command line prompt blinked in a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the dark green glass of the hidden terminal. "Enter command clearance Sekinchi." Avery Prescott stared at the screen, his breath completely catching in his throat. He had a master's degree in systems architecture from MIT, and he had personally overseen the digital security framework for Vanguard Global. Yet, looking at the command interface Garrett had uncovered, he felt like a child looking at a foreign language. Garrett didn't hesitate for a single second. His large, scarred fingers moved across the rugged mechanical keyboard with absolute fluidity. He typed a staggering 32-character alphanumeric string without checking a single reference sheet or pausing to recall the sequence. Alpha X-Ray 908 Delta Uniform Sierra 04. Avery's eyes went wider with every keystroke. That's a triple encrypted variable cipher, he stammered, his voice dropping into a terrified whisper. The corporate network doesn't even recognize that syntax. That's a classified military logistical encryption prefix. The only place that deployment code exists is in the Department of Defense's Black Budget Infrastructure database. Garrett hit the heavy execution key with a solid click. The screen instantly flashed amber, a stream of raw, unparsed system data cascading down the monitor at a blinding speed. The automated red alarm lights in the ceiling suddenly ceased their frantic blinking, dying out completely before being replaced by a steady, solid blue glow. Deep within the core of the Meridian Spire, the frantic, high-pitched whining of the trapped ventilation system began to shift, dropping into a lower, heavier mechanical register. Natalie Sterling watched from the sofa, her hands tightly gripping her daughter's shoulders. She could feel the ambient temperature in the room rising rapidly. The air was growing thick, smelling faintly of ozone and scorched copper. Even with her total lack of technical knowledge, she knew the building was fighting a losing battle against its own massive weight. "What did you just do?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling as she looked at Garrett's broad back. "I just forced the main environmental computer to recognize a manual thermal extraction protocol," Garrett said, his eyes never leaving the data streams. The modern corporate software was trying to seal the building to protect the physical property. But the original military-grade foundation knows that when a structure undergoes this kind of compression stress, you don't seal it, you let it breathe. A sudden, sharp metallic bang echoed from directly beneath the floorboards, causing several of the board members to yell in terror. Preston Brooks scrambled backward, losing his balance and sliding onto the polished quartz floor, his expensive watch scratching loudly against the stone. "It's not enough," Avery whispered, pointing a shaking finger at a rapidly ascending bar graph on the bottom of the screen. "Look at the compression metrics on the eastern core column. The pressure is still climbing. The manual override is trying to open the primary release valves in the sub-basement, but the automated security gates are physically blocking the pneumatic lines. Garrett's jaw tightened. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the system readouts with a cold, analytical intensity that sent a chill down Natalie's spine. This wasn't the face of a maintenance worker who swept floors and changed light bulbs. This was the face of a man who had looked into the jaws of absolute catastrophe before and hadn't blinked. The pneumatic gates are locked by a physical solenoid at the base of the spire, Garrett said, his voice entirely devoid of panic, dropping into a low, authoritative register that demanded absolute obedience. The digital override can only bypass the logic loop. It can't move the physical steel if the line is jammed by structural distortion. Then we're dead. Preston Brooks whimpered from the floor, his face completely wet with sweat. The whole damn tower is going to fold in on itself. Shut up, Natalie commanded sharply, her voice cutting through the billionaire's hysterics. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, but her eyes locked onto Garrett. The sheer contrast between the wealthy, powerful people in her boardroom and this humble single father was staggering. When the alarms had first sounded, every executive with an elite degree and millions in the bank had frozen, dissolving into absolute panic. But Garrett Vance had become a rock. The chaotic environment seemed to make him steadier, his quiet masculinity acting as an invisible shield that kept the raw terror of the situation from completely consuming the room. She looked down at Maya. Her daughter was still sitting quietly on the sofa, her small hands holding Chloe's crayon drawing completely flat against her knees, her eyes fixed entirely on Garrett with a sense of total, unwavering trust. Vance, Natalie said, stepping closer to the console, her voice dropping its defensive edge entirely. Tell me what needs to be done. No corporate filters, just tell me the truth. Garrett finally turned his head, his steady blue eyes meeting hers. The absolute calm radiating from him was hypnotic. The eastern column is taking 80% of the structural load because the modern renovations added 10,000 tons of uncompensated weight to the upper executive decks, Garrett stated flatly. The automated systems are trying to save the roof, but they're crushing the foundation to do it. I can write a script to force the Western hydraulic stabilizers to take the weight, but it requires a physical authorization key to be turned simultaneously in the main control room on this floor. Where is the main control room? Avery asked. Garrett pointed toward the heavily reinforced, solid steel security door at the far end of the executive corridor, behind that bulkhead. But the automated lockdown has pressurized that entire sector. The airlock door is holding back 3 atmospheres of pneumatic pressure from the ruptured HVAC lines. If someone tries to open that door without the proper sequence, the decompression will shatter every glass panel on this floor instantly. A bright flashing crimson banner suddenly ruptured across the green terminal screen. Critical course compression warning. Constructural tier imminent. Time to catastrophic failure, 60 seconds. Before anyone could speak, a massive explosive boom detonated from somewhere directly above the ceiling panels, and the entire 40-story glass tower gave a violent, agonizing lurch to the left. The violent lurch of the 40-story spire threw the remaining board members to the floor. Polished leather shoes skidded across the tilted quartz, and expensive portfolios scattered like autumn leaves in a gale. Preston Brooks slid heavily against the base of the conference table, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps as he clutched a bruised shoulder. The grand mahogany table groaned as its locking casters finally snapped, tilting precariously toward the shattered glass partition. Natalie Sterling felt the floor drop beneath her. She threw her body over Maya, pinning her daughter to the sofa as the world around them seemed to tear itself apart. The sheer, overwhelming terror of the moment stripped away every remaining layer of her executive composure. She was a woman who controlled billions, a woman who dictated market trends, but right now, as the concrete core of her empire screamed under unbearable stress, she was entirely at the mercy of gravity and steel. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final catastrophic descent, but the final crash never came. Through the haze of falling acoustic dust and the blinding glare of the blue emergency lights, Natalie opened her eyes. Garrett Vance was still standing. He hadn't fallen. His boots were planted firmly against the tilted quartz, his powerful frame leaning perfectly into the angle of the building's deflection. His quiet masculinity wasn't just a posture anymore. It was a physical force holding the room together. While every elite executive in the room cried out in terror, Garrett remained a monument of absolute, unwavering stability. He didn't waste a single second. Garrett lunged toward his heavy canvas tool bag, pulling out a heavy forged steel pressure wrench and a handheld digital diagnostic link. He strode down the executive corridor toward the heavily reinforced solid steel security bulkhead at the far end. "Vance, what are you doing?" Avery Prescott shouted, pulling himself up by the edge of the terminal desk, his glasses hanging crookedly off his face. I told you, that sector is pressurized to 3 atmospheres. If you break that seal manually, the explosive decompression will tear this entire floor apart. I'm not going to break the seal, Garrett said, his low baritone cutting through the residual echoes of the shifting steel. I'm going to bleed it. He reached the massive steel bulkhead. High above the doorframe, a digital pressure gauge pulsed a violent, warning red, displaying the terrifying atmospheric imbalance within the HVAC core. Garrett didn't look at the warning. He bypassed the electronic keypad entirely, his eyes tracking a small, circular steel cap near the base of the frame, a structural bypass valve that had been completely painted over during the modern corporate renovations. With a single, brutal strike of his wrench, Garrett shattered the decorative molding covering the valve. He fitted the heavy tool onto the unmapped steel bolt and threw his entire weight into the turn. The metal resisted for a fraction of a second, screeching in protest, before finally giving way. A deafening, high-pitched hiss erupted from the frame, a screaming torrent of compressed air that blasted a cloud of white condensation across the corridor. The sheer force of the venting pressure blew Garrett's jack back against his shoulders, but his hands never shook. He held the wrench steady, his jaw clenched, tracking the rapidly dropping digital gauge with a cold, mathematical precision. Natalie watched him from the sofa, her hands trembling as she held a terrified Maya against her chest. She looked at the raw, calculated focus on Garrett's face. This was a man who didn't just understand machinery, he understood the psychology of a crisis. He didn't rush, he didn't panic. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of an absolute expert. The screaming hiss of air slowly decayed into a low, hollow whistle. The crimson warning light on the bulkhead suddenly snapped to a neutral, steady amber. The pressure had equalized. Garrett disengaged the wrench, grabbed the heavy mechanical locking handle of the bulkhead, and threw it upward with a resounding, metallic clank. The massive steel door swung open, revealing the dark, humming cavern of the primary control suite behind it. Avery Prescott scrambled down the corridor, stopping at the threshold of the room. His jaw completely dropped as he stared at the primary diagnostic terminal inside. The main system monitors, which had been completely dead just minutes prior, were suddenly alive with cascading columns of encrypted data. How are you reading these streams?" Avery whispered, his voice shaking as he watched Garrett connect his personal diagnostic link directly into the core mainframe. Vanguard Global's proprietary operating system requires a dedicated corporate encryption key that is updated hourly by our off-site data centers. No regular technician has access to this data layer. "It's not a corporate layer," Garrett said, his fingers flying across the auxiliary terminal keys with a speed that defied his rugged appearance. He bypassed the modern Vanguard user interface, diving deep into the hard-coded machine architecture of the Spire's primary foundation. Suddenly, the terminal speaker crackled to life. A stark, synthesized automated voice echoed through the control room, completely bypassing the corporate security overrides. "Krikentow interest detected. Encrypt course Vorstei initiated." The main wall monitor instantly wiped the Vanguard Global corporate logo, replacing it with a bold, dark green crest featuring a stylized fortress and a pair of crossed engineering transits. Below the crest, a block of text began to populate in bright white letters. Agentification confirmed. Vance, Garrett M. Rank, Colonel, Regimental Commander, Retrid, United States Army Corps of Engineers clearance level, Omni Director, Critical Eye Infrastructure Defense. Avery Prescott stepped backward, his heel catching on a loose wire as he stared at the screen in absolute, paralyzing shock. "Colonel," he breathed, his eyes shifting from the screen to the quiet, humble man in the faded work uniform. You didn't just build this foundation. You're the Garrett Vance, who authored the Federal Department of Defense guidelines for structural hardening after the global logistics crisis. You're a tactical engineering legend." The entire boardroom fell into a deathly silence. Preston Brooks slowly stood up from the floor, his face completely frozen as he stared into the control room. The junior executives who had chuckled at the grease monkey earlier now looked as though they had seen a ghost. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it completely shattered. The man they had publicly humiliated, the man they had treated as an invisible, expendable piece of corporate garbage, was a decorated military mastermind who possessed the ultimate authority over the very ground they stood on. Natalie Sterling stood slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at Garrett. She remembered his quiet dignity when she had fired him, his total lack of desperation, his calm acceptance of her arrogance. He hadn't been defeated by her words. He had simply been operating on a level of reality that she couldn't even comprehend. Garrett didn't look back at the stunned crowd. His eyes remained locked on the terminal screen as a final crushing system alert began to flash across the green interface. Western hydraulic stabilization grids engaged. Autonomous lock confirmed. Manuel Oversinks inquired immediately. "We're out of time," Garrett stated, his voice dropping into a commanding military register that sent a shiver through the room. "The primary stabilizer line is locked behind a dual-key protocol. I need a secondary authorization signature from the principal corporate officer right now." Natalie didn't hesitate. She stepped over the debris, her sharp heels clicking against the stone as she rushed into the control room, leaving the cold, arrogant CEO behind entirely. "I'm here," she said, her hands steadying as she stood beside the man who held all their lives in his hands. "Tell me what to do, Colonel." Natalie Sterling stepped into the narrow, metallic confines of the primary control suite. The cold, unyielding corporate titan, who had dominated the boardroom only minutes ago, had vanished, replaced by a mother desperate to save her child and an executive who finally understood the true depth of her own ignorance. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as she looked at the blinking terminal screen. Garrett didn't move away to give her space. His presence was an anchor in the cramped room. He pointed to a secondary, heavy brass mechanical slot embedded into the reinforced steel frame of the console. "Insert your biometric executive card into that reader," Garrett commanded calmly, his voice a steady, low rumble. "The automated military grid needs to verify the physical presence of the primary asset holder before it allows the seismic stabilization fluid to pump into the Western structural channels." Natalie's fingers were trembling so violently she could barely slide the plastic card from her blazer pocket. She dropped it once, the sharp piece of plastic clattering against the metal deck. As she bent down to grab it, her breathing hitched, the sheer, suffocating weight of the panic finally threatening to break her resolve. Before she could reach it, Garrett's large, calloused hand swept down, smoothly retrieving the card. He didn't hand it back immediately. Instead, he gently closed his fingers over hers, his grip firm, warm, and entirely steady. The physical contrast was staggering. Her hands were cold, manicured, and shaking with the weight of an empire. His were rough, scarred from years of brutal engineering work, and projecting an absolute, unshakable strength. "Look at me, Natalie," Garrett said softly. She turned her head, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears, meeting his piercing blue gaze. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't looking at a subordinate, an investor, or a competitor. She was looking at a man who required absolutely nothing, from her wealth or status to command complete authority. "The castle isn't going to fall," Garrett said, his voice dropping into that quiet, masculine register that instantly cut through her internal chaos. "Breathe. I've got you." Natalie let out a long, shuddering exhale. The trembling in her hands didn't stop entirely, but the cold, paralyzing terror in her chest began to melt away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of security. She nodded, her gaze lingering on his face for a split second longer than necessary before she guided her hand, still supported by his, to insert the card into the mechanical reader. The terminal emitted a sharp, authoritative tone. "Executive citation vir sync protool active. On my mark, you're going to throw that heavy steel breaker on the left wall while I execute the command sequence on the keyboard," Garrett instructed, his body leaning over the console as his fingers hovered over the keys. 3, 2, 1, move. Natalie slammed her weight against the heavy steel breaker lever. Deep beneath the floorboards, a sound erupted that felt less like machinery and more like a tectonic shift. A massive, low-frequency thrumming vibrated through the core of the Meridian spire, a heavy, rhythmic pulsing as thousands of gallons of specialized stabilization fluid were violently forced into the Western structural columns to balance the immense, lopsided load. The 40-story tower groaned one final time, a long, drawn-out mechanical sigh before slowly, miraculously shifting back toward its true vertical axis. The tilt disappeared. The shattered glass on the floor settled into a still, glittering carpet. The main terminal screen flashed a steady, calming green. Western core stabilized. Constructural efficiency 98%. System normal. The heavy steel security grates sealing the executive boardroom slowly, mechanically retracted into the ceiling headers with a soft hiss, opening the pathways to the service stairwells and the newly restored elevator shafts. Avery Prescott let out a breathless, weak laugh from the corridor, collapsing against the wall in sheer exhausted relief. It worked," he muttered. "The load is completely balanced." Garrett stood up straight, pulling his diagnostic link from the terminal, his face immediately resetting into his standard, stoic expression. "The immediate danger is neutralized," he said, turning back toward the boardroom. "But the structure still needs a full engineering audit. Everyone needs to move down the service stairs in an orderly fashion. Now." As Garrett walked out of the control room, the executive stood in a stunned, silent line, parting like the Red Sea to let him pass. Preston Brooks stood near the broken mahogany table, his face twisted in a deep, agonizing mix of humiliation and lingering fear. He couldn't even bring himself to meet Garrett's eyes. The billionaire who had offered $1 million to save his own skin now looked utterly small, stripped entirely of the unearned arrogance that his money had provided. Garrett ignored him completely, walking directly toward the sofa. Maya was still sitting there, her small hands holding Chloe's crayon drawing perfectly flat against her knees. The moment she saw Garrett, her face lit up, and she stood up, holding the paper out like a trophy. "I kept it completely flat, Garrett," she said proudly. "Just like you told me." Garrett dropped to one knee, a warm, genuine smile breaking through his rugged exterior as he took the paper. "You did an incredible job, Deputy. The castle is perfectly safe because of you." Natalie stepped out of the control room, her posture straight once more. But the cold, impenetrable wall she usually maintained was completely gone. She watched Garrett interact with her daughter, her throat tight with a deep, silent reverence. She had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, surrounded herself with the most powerful minds in the country, and yet, she had never felt as safe as she did standing in the presence of a terminated maintenance worker who was, in reality, a military legend. "Colonel Vance," Natalie said softly, stepping closer as Garrett stood back up. "Just Garrett, ma'am," he replied, slipping the crayon drawing back into his civilian jacket. "I'm off the clock." Natalie looked down at her hands, which were finally still. She took a slow step forward, the distance between them shrinking, the ambient blue light of the emergency grid casting a soft cinematic glow across the ruined elegance of the executive suite. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice dropping into a rare, intimate whisper that no one else in the room could hear. "I owe you my daughter's life. And I am deeply sorry for how I treated you this morning." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, the silence between them stretching, filled with an intense, unspoken emotional chemistry. "You don't need to apologize for not seeing what wasn't on the resume, Natalie," Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that sent a soft thrill through her chest. "You were protecting your territory. I respect that. But territory doesn't mean much if you don't keep the foundation solid." Natalie offered a small, vulnerable smile, her eyes locked onto his. "I'm beginning to realize that," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life building the roof. I think it's time I started looking at the foundation." Before Garrett could reply, Donovan Cross and a team of heavily armed corporate security guards burst through the newly opened service stairwell doors, their tactical flashlights cutting through the amber haze. "CEO Sterling," Cross shouted, rushing forward. "The perimeter is secure. We have emergency transport waiting for you at the base of the tower." Natalie didn't look at Cross. Her eyes never left Garrett's face. "My daughter and I will be exiting via the service stairs with Garrett," Natalie announced with absolute, unyielding authority, leaving the security chief blinking in confusion. "Avery, ensure the rest of the board is escorted down safely." She turned back to Garrett, her expression softer, filled with a quiet, lingering anticipation. "Lead the way, Garrett." The descent down the concrete service stairwell was a silent, rhythmic procession. Garrett carried Maya on his broad shoulders, her small hands still clutching Chloe's crayon, drawing like a sacred amulet, while Natalie walked closely by his side. Every few floors, the remnants of the building's thermal venting hissed through the pipes, but the terrifying groans of the structural core had completely ceased. The Meridian Spire was breathing again, anchored firmly by the hidden military protocols Garrett had awakened. When they finally pushed through the ground floor exit doors, the blinding winter afternoon light hit them, accompanied by a wall of sound. The grand plaza surrounding the skyscraper was a sea of thousands of evacuated Vanguard Global employees, emergency response vehicles, flashing red and blue strobe lights, and swarming news crews. Sirens wailed in the distance, and the air was thick with the collective nervous energy of a crowd that had just stared down a catastrophe. As soon as Natalie's tailored blazer was spotted by the perimeter security teams, a surge of photographers and high-level executives rushed toward them. Donovan Cross tried to push his way to the front, barking orders into his radio, while a bank of microphones was thrust toward the CEO. Preston Brooks, who had taken the executive elevator down the moment power was restored, was already standing near the media barrier. His hair was neatly combed again, his wrinkled suit smoothed out, and he was already speaking into a television camera, his voice dripping with smooth, unearned confidence. "It was a highly complex software anomaly in our climate systems," Brooks was telling the reporter, flashing a practiced, corporate smile. "But thanks to the swift, decisive action of the executive board and our capital management team, we initiated the proper seismic overrides. Vanguard Global always prioritizes." Preston, Natalie's voice cut through the plaza like ice. Brooks paused mid-sentence, the camera panning instantly to follow Natalie as she stepped forward. She didn't look like the polished, untouchable CEO who had stepped into the building that morning. Her hair was slightly disheveled from the stairwell, and her blazer carried a faint dusting of concrete powder. but the absolute authority radiating from her was completely overwhelming. "Get out of the way of that camera," Natalie said, her voice carrying a terrifying coldness that made the billionaire investor step back in shock. The crowd of executives and reporters went completely silent. Natalie turned to face the main news pool, her eyes scanning the senior board members who had gathered nearby. "This morning, I made a catastrophic error in judgment," Natalie announced, her voice amplifying across the quieted plaza. "I allowed the illusion of corporate titles and financial metrics to dictate how I measured the value of a human being. I publicly terminated a man because I believed his uniform made him invisible to the success of this company." She turned slowly, her gaze landing on Garrett, who was standing quietly near the edge of the security line, having gently set Maya back on her feet. "If it were not for the quiet brilliance, the unshakable courage, and the elite expertise of Colonel Garrett Vance," Natalie continued, ensuring every microphone captured her words, "every single person on the upper 40 floors of the Meridian Spire would be buried under 10,000 tons of steel right now. The executive board didn't save this tower. Money didn't save this tower. This man did." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of junior executives. The men who had laughed at the grease monkey in the corridor now stared at Garrett with a profound, burning sense of shame. Preston Brooks opened his mouth to protest, to protect his ego, but Natalie didn't give him the chance. "And as of this exact second," Natalie stated, looking directly at Brooks, "Vanguard Global is terminating its infrastructure contracts with your investment group. Your shares will be liquidated at the opening bell. We do not do business with cowards. Avery, draft the paperwork." Avery Prescott, standing near the medical tents, offered a genuine, triumphant smile. "Copy that, ma'am." Before the reporters could erupt into a barrage of questions, a small, familiar voice pierced the crowd from the edge of the plaza. "Daddy!" Garrett's stoic expression completely shattered. He spun around just as Toby Miller came jogging through the security barrier, holding the hand of a 7-year-old girl with a chaotic halo of brown curls and a massive, gap-toothed smile. "Chloe!" Garrett called out. He dropped to both knees, his broad shoulders widening as Chloe sprinted across the polished stone plaza, completely ignoring the cameras and the wealthy crowds. She launched herself into his arms, her small legs wrapping around his waist as she buried her face into his neck. Garrett held her with an intense, fierce protectiveness, his large hand cradling the back of her head, his eyes closing as he breathed her in. The quiet, intimidating masculine force that had saved the skyscraper shifted entirely into the pure, soft devotion of a father who had found his home. Natalie watched the embrace, a profound warmth blooming in her chest that she hadn't felt in a lifetime. She looked at her daughter, Maya, who was smiling widely, holding up Chloe's drawing toward the little girl. "Look, Chloe," Maya called out, stepping closer. "I guarded the castle. I kept it completely flat." Chloe peeked out from Garrett's shoulder, her eyes lighting up. "You did?" "Yeah." Maya nodded proudly. "Your daddy made me his deputy." Natalie stepped over to Garrett, kneeling down on the cold stone beside him, completely unbothered by the dirt or the cameras capturing her rare vulnerability. She looked at Chloe, then up at Garrett, her eyes locked onto his with an intense, deep emotional chemistry that had grown from the ashes of the crisis. "You have an incredible father, Chloe," Natalie said softly, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "He's a real hero." "I know," Chloe said matter-of-factly, wiping a stray curl from her face. "He can fix anything." Natalie offered a soft, brilliant smile, her gaze rising back to meet Garrett's piercing blue eyes. "He certainly can," she whispered. Garrett stood up slowly, lifting Chloe onto his hip with effortless strength. He looked at Natalie, the silence between them filled with a deep, mutual respect and an unspoken promise of something new. "So, Garrett," Natalie said, her voice dropping into a lighter, almost playful tone that her employees had never heard before. "Seeing as you are officially unemployed, the position of Chief Operations and Infrastructure Director for Vanguard Global's entire international portfolio just opened up. It comes with a permanent seat on the executive board, a comprehensive family package, and a direct oversight mandate that answers only to me. What do you say?" The surrounding executives held their breath, waiting for the humble worker to eagerly grasp at the multi-million-dollar opportunity. But Garrett Vance merely looked down at his daughter, then back at the powerful CEO. He didn't look dazzled by the wealth or the title. His quiet masculinity remained entirely grounded. "I don't work weekends," Natalie, Garrett said, a slow, incredibly charming smile breaking through his rugged features. "And my daughter comes to the office whenever she wants." Natalie's smile widened, her eyes reflecting the bright winter sky as she took a single, confident step closer to him. "Colonel," she whispered, her voice laced with a deep, undeniable warmth, "you can bring the whole castle with you. I'll make sure the foundation is ready."